So creating alliances across regions and especially across latitudes can be really valuable for accessing seed that might be adapted to what your environment is becoming. And also collaborating with plant breeders. A great example of this in terms of gene flow is here in California, where there are a number of heirloom bean varieties that people are interested in, but most of them are very susceptible to bean common mosaic virus. Excuse me, which is very widespread in California and other parts of the country. However, a plant breeder, including a plant breeding PhD student at UC Davis, has now been moving alleles for resistance to bean common mosaic virus into a number of heirloom varieties, making it possible for those to be grown without that problem. So alliances with collaborations with plant breeders can be another effective way of using the positive benefits of gene flow to increasing diversity in your seed stock. The other process that determines diversity in crop populations that's really important in terms of diversity and adaptation is selection. So selection is basically favoring when one individual or a set of individuals are favored for contributing genes to the next generation. So it can be a problem when selection is very severe, when the selection differential is very strong. We're saving only a few seeds from a small garden population. You can reduce diversity a lot in cross-pollinating species. You can have inbreeding problems. And then you lose that diversity that you're interested in keeping for future adaptation. So just stepping back a moment, it's really important to remember that adaptation reflects selection to respond to past environments. So adaptation is always referring to the past, right? The most recent it can be in reference to is last year, if you selected seeds last year. But again, adaptation is always referring to the past. And so that's why heirloom varieties, land races in other parts of the world can be really valuable. But in some cases, they might not be, because they are adaptations to a climate that is quickly changing and that no longer exists. So selection in the past is questionable sometimes, and it's something that we have to look at carefully and see if new varieties need to be brought in or developed. So potential benefits from selection are adaptation to the biophysical environment, and also to characteristics that members of the community are interested in. So discouraging the problems that selection can create are things that a number of seed libraries also are very good at. They're concerned about inbreeding depression, and so they really encourage people to have large populations of maize, for example, if they're growing those. You can consider pooling populations of the same variety if you're conducting selection on many different gardens, and then maybe pooling them together to maintain some diversity in that variety while also giving it some selection. You can encourage the benefits that selection provides by letting the environment select to support that adaptation. That means maybe not pampering your plants quite as much, maybe letting them experience a little more heat, a little more drought in your garden. You can form regional adaptation groups, and I know this is occurring in a number of areas where you're working on different kinds of seed that everyone is growing and sharing together and observing and maybe doing experiments with. Maybe there are only a few people in your group or in your community who have more experience, and they can be selection specialists. Or maybe you can develop a core of people that work together to identify what is it that we want to select for, and then let's go and try that and experiment with it and see how our populations respond to that and if that's working for us. So if we try and bring those two processes together, so we have gene flow on the one hand, which encourages diversity, mostly in most cases, and then we have selection on the other hand, which reduces diversity but can create greater adaptation. How can we balance those in the context of gardens, in addition to those methods that I outlined on the previous two slides? Well, one way is to think about how that tension between the two of them interacts, and we can use them together depending on what our goals are. So if we look at this little cartoon on the left-hand side, at the very top, example A is showing what happens when we're roguing, right? When we're just eliminating those plants in our population that are off types. They don't look right, we don't like them. There aren't that many of them, but we don't want those contributing to the next generation. So we're just removing a small proportion of our population. So we're not really reducing diversity hugely. That's one way of conducting selection. Another way is maintenance selection. So you're tightening down the population a little bit more. You're removing both tails of the distribution to really maintain that median characteristic that you're familiar with and that you like. You don't want, for example, basil leaves that are too large. You don't want them that are too small. You like sort of a medium-sized basil leaf. So you're removing those two tails. And then the last example is positive selection. And this is what most of us typically think about when we think about plant breeding and selection in general, that you're finding those great, perfect, the best plants, and you're saving seeds only from them. So what happens though is you go from A to B to C. As you can see, you eliminate more and more diversity. Your selection is getting more and more focused. And in that sense, especially at the scale of gardens or groups of gardens, gene flow becomes more and more important as you move through from A through C. So if you're conducting very stringent selection, you should probably also be thinking about gene flow, maybe through having collaborations with other gardeners growing the same variety, maybe a regional group where you pool that same variety after you each select, or do something along those lines so that you can maintain enough diversity in that crop variety to be able to respond as changes occur in our environments. So that is one of the things that we are trying to do in California. We are starting just this year. In fact, I planted my seeds on Sunday for an experiment that is distributed over 11 different locations through the state. And we are all seed savers, some very experienced seed librarians, seed activists, and we're all growing the same population of diverse bush beans. And the thing about this population is that it includes multiple genotypes, and we know what those are, and we are each planting the same proportion of those genotypes. And so we will be able to watch and see what happens with this diversity as we plant it across the state, across this great expanse of latitudes in our home gardens, and observe our plants and talk about how they're performing, what we're looking for in terms of adaptation, what the environment is favoring and not favoring, and really kind of digging into these questions of how do you manage diversity and adaptation at the scale of gardens. And this is something that hasn't been investigated, and I think it's really important because it's a great example of community science. And community science is this whole idea of working together, but especially working to answer questions that arise from a community, from activists or practitioners. And so they're not questions that come from research centers, and they're not questions that fit into the kind of experiments that formal scientists might typically design or conduct, but they're experiments that are designed specifically to answer community questions. And we have to figure it out as we go, and that's what we're going to be doing. So this is one example, but there are other collaborations that are in place or starting to occur, both in terms of seeds, in terms of agriculture in other ways, and in terms of a lot of other areas of community-based inquiry. And I encourage all of you to look into it some more, because it's a very powerful way that we can take those methods of observing, experimenting, and working together and develop some new information that will be useful for us all as we move forward with all the changes we're experiencing. So just to end, I want to remind you of this model that for me is very helpful to refer to come back to remind myself that, yeah, I have strategies that are familiar, methods that have worked for me very well over time and in different places to cope with the variation that occurs all the time in gardens. We're always familiar with variation. But as trends of change that are occurring in the 21st century start to exceed that range of familiar variation, I'm going to need to figure out, and we're all going to need to figure out, ways that we can adapt, ways that we can either develop our own new methods or borrow different methods from other areas, or come together and work to create new methods or to share them amongst each other, new methods and new materials as well, and do whatever we can to expand our response capacity in the face of these kinds of trends that we're experiencing. And then also to keep in mind that there will be a point beyond which we won't be able to adapt, and we should be ready to either completely transform our gardening practice, or we may have to abandon it. For example, in the summer, there will be places where summer gardening just won't work anymore. So, but if we can have that progression clear in our minds, and we can work within it, and we can work together to expand that response capacity, I think it will be very helpful and very powerful. So thank you all for being here. I don't even know how many people are here. And thank you to the Seed Libraries organization, and especially to Rebecca for being an unbelievable organizer of this and many, many other things. So I hope we can have a conversation. I know it's difficult with Zoom, so we have to take turns muting our microphones, otherwise we'll all be hearing lots of feedback. But